Welcome to the show. I'm Riz Khan. The annual cost of cybercrime is expected to reach $10 trillion next year. To put that figure into context, in terms of GDP, it would be the third biggest economy in the world after the US and China. That's why countries from Australia to China, the UK and US are racing to tighten up their cybersecurity laws. And it's why the UN is expected to pass a landmark cyber treaty in the coming weeks. From deepfakes and disinformation to hacks and attacks on infrastructure, healthcare and security networks, cybercrime is becoming the #1 challenge for law enforcement and intelligence agencies. And artificial intelligence is already changing the rules of the game. Now, our increasingly connected digital world makes us all more vulnerable to criminal gangs and state-sponsored hackers who can access our data and devices. Imagine them taking control of your bank account, your electrical vehicle, and even your pacemaker. Well, many of the world's leading experts on cybercrime recently met in the Saudi capital, Riyadh, at the Global Cybersecurity Forum. They included senior figures from Interpol, GCHQ, and even a cyber psychologist and profiler who inspired the popular TV crime drama CSI Cyber. We'll get an in-depth look at the issues, starting with my first guest, Inglis, who was appointed by President Joe Biden to lead cyber operations in the US. Chris, thank you for making the time. Much appreciated. Now, if cybercrime could be likened to the Wild West, it sounds like President Biden called you in to be the sheriff.
Yes, that's an apt metaphor in terms of that time, but I'd like to call it the coach, because like in the sport world, coaches are responsible for the game plan, the strategy, the assignment of that strategy to various role players, but they don't actually step onto the field and try to kick the ball, right? So they actually are responsible for the fabric within which the players operate. And so that really was the role, because cyber is wider than it is tall. That's a bit of a cipher, but it's really about how do you take all the pieces that already exist and apply them in a way that becomes coherent and effective.
That width makes it sound much harder to manage, because if it's a narrow, tall silo.
Oh, it is. If you're in charge of something and you can direct, because you're the smartest person in the room, and I've never been that person, if you can direct, then it's pretty straightforward. People simply obey your commands. But no one in the room is as smart as everyone in the room when the room is full of cyberspace, right? And so you just have to figure out, how do you actually then create a fabric within which all the pieces make sense? And it's made even more interesting because this is a collaboration that must exist between the private sector and the public sector. And in the United States, and I'm sure in many other places as well, the private sector doesn't work for the government works for the private sector. And so you can't subordinate one to the other. They have to actually be in a collaboration.
So I was thinking that perhaps the highest profile threat in a generation was those recent assassination attempts on President Donald Trump. Does cybersecurity have a role to play in that kind of situation, or is that just someone who's like an amateurish, low-tech lone wolf? And if that's the case, does it put them beyond detection from those kind of cybersecurity threats?
Well, I think it depends upon what your definition of a cyber threat is, and I think I would be expansive in that definition. We care about cyber threats because they might hold data or computers at risk. But we also care about it because the abstraction of data and computers delivers critical functions, like energy supplies, or for that matter, the ability to conduct an election. And so that critical function is an abstraction of the piece parts that are at the foundations. But cyberspace also delivers confidence. In a free and open society, depending upon a free and open architecture, the internet, we depend upon that to reliably meet our expectations. When I flip the light switch, I want it to go on. And if that confidence can be held at risk because of disinformation, or because of flows of information that are restricted or modified, then cyber's in play in terms of how people think about the threats in their world and react accordingly.
It's interesting you say it that way, because we've learned about death threats and assassination plots being levied by Iran against former President Trump, and Russian groups targeting US influencers in order to sway voter opinion on elections and election campaigns. How serious is the threat facing the US, and what do you see the role of cybersecurity being in countering them?
Well, let's use the Russian example. And I'm no longer a sitting government official, so I say this as a private citizen, but with the experience that I can bring to bear, I would say that my bet is that the Russians were not attempting to simply steal data, or to, for that matter, even hold the election at risk in 2016, 18, 20, this goes on every 2 years, but rather to hold the confidence of the United States at risk. I think that was the aim. And in that regard, it's a serious threat. If all you cared about is whether all the votes have been properly tallied, I don't think we have a significant threat. We actually know how to defend the digital infrastructure and the processes on top of that. But defending confidence, that's a matter that's altogether different and harder. And so what we have to do is to provide a solid foundation where there should be no question that the digital infrastructure is doing what it does. And at that point, then leadership takes over, hopefully enlightened, transcendent, leadership, which actually would make the case for democracy in this day going forward, that our best days are ahead of us.
It's so interesting because the way you're describing it, we're talking in effect about cyber psychology. The cybersecurity is essentially a psychological threat as well.
Well, it is, because what are the nouns of cyberspace? They're not just technology. The choices that people make predict what the cyber futures are going to be. And the assignment of roles, responsibilities, or not, also defines our cyber future. So we got to get all of those right. The human being is at least in two of those three pillars I just identified. Psychology is necessarily in play.
Really interesting. Now, many conflicts around the world follow strategies that have been used in previous engagements. But the world was taken aback by the Israeli operation to detonate pagers and beepers, and walkie-talkies were used by members of Hezbollah. What was your reaction to that? And was it a game changer in the way people have to think about cybersecurity?
I don't think it was a game changer in terms of the art of the possible. It might be a game changer in terms of whether someone's willing to use that. Look, cyber has kind of broadly three purposes. One is it helps us synchronize assets that are not in cyberspace, they're in the physical world. Again, I've talked about the flow of electricity, the conduct of an election. Those are physical kind of activities that have some tangible form, but we use digital infrastructure to synchronize those, to coordinate those. Cyber can actually have an effect inside cyberspace. I create a bank account, sustain a bank account, or might steal that bank account almost entirely in cyberspace. I would never do that, to be clear. But that all happens in cyberspace in the form of zeros and ones, bits. But cyber also has an effect on confidence, as we've talked about earlier. Back to my first point, cyber can coordinate physical assets in the real world. And if those assets are the walkie-talkies or the pagers that are carried in the pockets of Hezbollah, then cyber has always been capable of doing that. The question is whether we employ it for that purpose. And so we shouldn't be surprised about what the art of the possible looks like when somebody finally effects it.
So this is that kind of threshold between, as you say, the ones and zeros and the real world impact.
Right. I think there's an oft-told phrase in the United States, which is we sometimes suffer a failure of imagination, not realizing what the full kind of power of the technology or the systems, the connection of this technology, what that might be. And I think in cyberspace that's been ever thus. We need to think our way through what's the full power of this technology that we created, and is it still subordinate to our interest? Is it still something that serves our purposes as we would effect them? And are the values associated with how we use those something that we can not simply be proud of, but actually endure over time in creating the civil order that we prefer?
So is that kind of preemptive strike we saw against Hezbollah something the US could consider doing in a similar way? And how far can you go down the road from being, say, cyber defensive to cyber offensive?
Look, the United States, along with a number of other nations, has signed what's called the UN Global Group of Experts, CODA. I think it was about 2015. That described a set of things that responsible nations should do in their use of cyberspace. And one of those was that we would not hold critical infrastructure at risk or civilian populations at risk. Far be it from me to judge or to assess whether what the Israelis did against Hezbollah was kind of within the lanes of an ongoing war, and therefore under the laws of war might be deemed to be necessary and appropriate, proportional to that need. But I think that's the standard, that's the legal standard that we have to apply. What do we do to make sure that we are defending our populations, our civilian kind of activities in times of peace? And what do we do to exercise force, physical force, only in the realm of what's needed and what's proportionate to that need? Again, I'm not sitting in judgment of what the Israelis did, but that's the lens through which the United States would look at such a thing.
Well, I wonder, sir, then, is the concept of cybersecurity blurring the lines when it comes to setting rules and codes?
I don't think it blurs the lines, but it increases the possibilities, right? So Cyber is an instrument of power. It's not the only instrument of power, and it's used in concert with other instruments of power. As you've already described, it can be used to control the instruments of war. It can be used to control the instruments of information dissemination or disinformation. It can be used to deliver critical functions. Cyber is integral to all of those things. It is a means, not necessarily the end to those purposes, and we need to think of it as such. Too often cyber is siloed as kind of the discipline that's kind of effected by IT specialists or cyber specialists, when in fact we're all implicated in cyber.
I wonder, when the US and Israel gave advance warning of a massive missile attack by Iran, is that the result of back-channel diplomacy, or does cybersecurity have a role to play in that?
I can't say. I wasn't involved in that particular action, certainly not in the government at the moment. But I would say, to the extent that one of the things that cyberspace can yield is information about the expectations, the aspirations of others, it is possible, plausible in my view, that cyber played a role in understanding what the expectations and intentions of Iran might be, and therefore gave not simply a source of that information, but a means to disseminate that information. Again, that's all hugely speculative on my part.
Looking at another conflict, what role has cybersecurity played in the Ukraine-Russia conflict?
Oh, it's a really good question. So the Russians, who have, against all rules of law, tried to impose their will physically on the Ukrainians, have also tried to do so virtually, in and through cyberspace. And against all odds, the Ukrainians have more than been able to defend themselves. The Ukrainians are numerically inferior to the Russians, and they perhaps don't have the depth of a bench in terms of access to technology that the Russians might. And yet the Ukrainians have succeeded in that regard. And how is that the case? The Ukrainians have invested enough in their technology so that it's defensible. It's not perfect. No one has the perfect technology infrastructure. They've invested a lot in their expertise so that they're world-class in their ability to defend that architecture. And finally, they've developed and deployed a coalition, such the Russians have to beat a range of organizations. They have to beat the Ukrainians, they have to beat private sector institutions, all of whom are assisting in the defense. They're not co-combatants. They're simply providing meaningful support to the defense. And I think that's actually a lesson for all of us, whether we're individuals, whether we're organizations. It's the strength of our coalition that's going to make the biggest difference, and the fact that we either do or do not know our disposition in cyberspace. If we get those two things right, then the technology is the lesser of our challenges.
Now, you've emphasized the importance of collaboration and cooperation, both at a domestic and global level.
Yes.
When it comes to this issue. Now, do you fear the possibility of a more isolationist US foreign policy under, say, a second Donald Trump presidency could harm such cooperation with global partners and therefore kind of effectively weaken the US's defense?
Well, I'll leave it to the next president to decide what sort of engagement the US should have with the rest of the world. But I do think that a reduction in the degree of collaboration the United States has with other countries is not simply to the collective detriment, but it's to the United States' detriment. There are perspectives and capabilities and, frankly, innovation that the United States alone cannot generate on its own behalf. And I think, to the extent that any group of organizations or people in excess of one typically performs at a better level geometrically than single efforts.
We're seeing kind of technology spread just beyond domestic and international to space. So I wonder what role cybersecurity plays when it comes to space wars.
Well, that's a good question. That's highly speculative on my part, not being a space expert in any way, shape, or form. But I think that space is a natural extension, right, of our life on Earth. And there are strategic assets in space that allow us to live the lives we prefer on Earth. And if they were held at risk, we'd be much the poorer for it. Global positioning system, the GPS, comes immediately to mind. There probably isn't a person in this room that hasn't used some geolocation service to try to figure out how to get from point A to point B quickly. But package delivery services use that. The US Postal Service uses that. We use that to synchronize things in time, not just space. That's one of many assets that are dependent upon space. And so if we held space at risk successfully, we would find egregious consequences here on Earth.
It's interesting when we look at the private sector and governments. Now, I wonder, in your opinion, to what degree can cybersecurity be trusted to the private sector, such as powerful players like Elon Musk, controlling, for example, a network of satellites.
Let's leave Elon Musk aside for the moment. That perhaps kind of conjures up all manner of things that are maybe kind of interesting, but not on my part well informed. But I would say that we have no choice but to cede a large part of this responsibility to the private sector. That's where innovation takes place. That's where capacity development takes place, deployment takes place. Defense, they're the first line of defense. So the private sector is, for want of any other viable solution, and I can think of none, they're really engaged in this, up to their necks. And we therefore have to appreciate that the government must support the private sector in creating a defensible architecture and actually defending that architecture, while not allowing or forcing the private sector to take on governmental responsibilities. There are certain responsibilities and authorities that must be retained by government. The ability to make war being one of those, diplomacy being those, speaking on behalf of nations that properly install governments. All of that's a governmental responsibility. But the government must support the private sector, which does most of the work by, with, and through cyberspace.
But effectively, the private sector has a lot of leverage over government because of the way things work as well now.
Well, they do. And so what I'm arguing for is not to essentially cede to each of those stovepipes, those silos, some degree of authority to operate as they do, but to achieve a degree of professional intimacy between those, a collaboration between those. In the United States, for much of our history, we've had a division of effort between the private sector and the public sector. They know one another, they meet at an interface, but each of them has a very different set of authorities, a different set of permissions in terms of how they proceed. And if we only got together and shared our knowledge at the moment of some extreme crisis, we find ourselves way behind, right, the crisis. So we have to actually have a professional intimacy at all levels of that, before a crisis, during a crisis, and our ability to act together, to intercede, to interdict, and to evict a crisis. Some of the best consultation between the private and the public sector should come as the government attempts to understand what its role can be. We need to take advice and counsel from the private sector. What do you need? How would you have us apply our governmental powers or our engagement of other governments? I think the private sector knows considerably more about the nature of the cyber domain than the government does, and yet they need government's assistance in actually doing the work required in that space.
And the framework, I guess, legislative framework that
exactly
would
right.
guide it all. Yeah.
Exactly right.
Sir, I have to ask you, the recent CrowdStrike outage, the faulty software distribution, cost billions of dollars to businesses, it disrupted flights and medical facilities around the world, and yet it was the result of an error rather than a malicious attack. What do we learn from that about the dangers that exist in essentially what is such a connected world?
Well, that connectivity comes with consequences, some good, some not so good. Right? So if you have a singular dependency, some single point of failure, it might be that it has a low probability of failure, but it has an extraordinarily high consequence in that failure, as we learned in the CrowdStrike failure. And so we have to make sure that when we have single points of failure, we redouble our efforts to say it might be a low probability, but given the high consequence, we need to actually redouble our efforts to ensure we got that part right. And perhaps kind of go back and achieve a degree of redundancy or have a backup system in place. That was perhaps most surprising for organizations that depended upon that combination of CrowdStrike and Microsoft. On the day that failed, they had no backup, right? And so you might expect CrowdStrike and Microsoft to address that. I would expect them to. But companies need to actually think their way through, what would I do if this piece of my enterprise failed? And if the answer is, I don't know, then you're taking a risk that you probably don't fully understand, and you certainly are not going to like when it happens.
Well, showing that vulnerability, can cyber defense ever be 100%, or is it just a matter of time before a major cyber attack succeeds, and maybe targeting vital infrastructure such as healthcare?
Well, somewhere in between. So to the first question of the three-part question, I would say that cyber defense can never be perfect. It's never possible. It's not possible to have a perfectly secure architecture, something that's impervious to all threats, for all time, that literally defends itself. The changing nature of the software, the hardware, and the engagement of people, right? The choices that they make, and the undulating nature of the assignment of roles response, it's just impossible to make it perfect. So at best, we can make it defensible. I'm not sure we've done that. We've not made it defensible, short of secure. And so I wouldn't say we're going to strive for mediocrity, let's just make it defensible. That's actually the knee of the curve, which means we then must defend it, right? And so I kind of, on that the second and third question, which implied, so is it inevitable that we fail? I don't think it's inevitable that we fail. It's inevitable that we meet with a cyber transgression, whether it's criminal or nation state. We meet with one that actually gets through a first level of defense. It's not inevitable that they then succeed. If we know our architecture, which is people and technology and the assignment of roles and responsibilities better than they do, then we can actually be more agile, more maneuverable inside that space. We just have to be vigilant, catch it at the earliest possible moment, engage it, and evict it at the earliest possible moment. We can, in fact, respond well if we've set up such that we're inherently resilient and prepared to respond well. I think that the measure of merit for most companies today is not whether they'll never suffer a breach, but are they actually capable of enduring that breach? Can they actually respond and recover well? And there are a number of companies who've done that, and they march on. And there are companies who've not done that well at all. And the difference between the two is not whether they lived in a dangerous world or they suffered a breach, but were they prepared for that? And it's generally the quality of the team as much as the quality of the architecture that determines that result.
The role you took on was pioneering and must have been quite an eye-opener because it was so kind of new. And I wonder, from that, what did you learn was the biggest threat people face from cybercrime? How well are they being protected? And what responsibility is there for individuals themselves to kind of take the lead?
What's surprising is still what I would describe as the proactive ambivalence on our part. And what do I mean by that? Everyone knows that there's an issue in cyberspace. I mean, there isn't a person that wouldn't say, yep, there's something wrong in that space. And yet so many of us say, I hope somebody else solves this, not realizing or not acknowledging that they have a part to play. And so I would say that there should be a consequence kind of imposed on those who transgress in this space. But we should first get our own house in order. Let's use the resources, the assets we already have. We've not done that.
A final thought, sir. It's often said that in cybersecurity, the weakest link is the human. And to make us all feel a bit more human, perhaps I could ask you, have you ever been hacked? Have you ever had your password forgotten or locked? Or I mean, what have you experienced?
Oh my goodness, yes. Well, maybe not the last part. I forgot my password or kind of locked myself out. Maybe I have. I've lived with systems that 3 times and you're out. And you've got to go see the system administrator. You're kind of, it's that moment of embarrassment and shame. But I had my identity stolen. Someone has filed my taxes as recently as this year. I'm given the publicly available information. And so the question is, am I prepared for that? Do I have some degree of kind of fire gap, between that event and the rest of my financial portfolio? I do, right? I've learned the lessons of those things will happen. And so can you identify it at the earliest possible moment? Can you stop it in its progress? And can you protect the rest of what they've not yet got access to? None of us is inured or safe from this. We're all in the same kind of bucket. And the question is, are you vigilant enough to determine that something is going on that you should engage at the earliest possible moment with the highest possible leverage? And do you have a coalition, right, that you can bring to bear such that whatever's holding you at risk, they got to beat all of you. They got to beat all of us in order to beat the one of us that they're after. I think that's actually the lesson that I've learned over time. And I try to practice that, maybe not perfectly, but ruthlessly day after day.
Well, the fact you had a wake-up call is quite a wake-up call for me too.
Well, you haven't lived until you try to file your taxes with the federal authorities within the United States, and they said that's a problem because you already have.
Oh,
right?
yeah, so, I hope I never come across that. Chris Inglis, thank you, sir, for your time.
Thanks very much.
Much
Pleasure to meet you. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you. Well, there's a lesson for us all. If America's former cyber czar can get hacked, we all need to be taking cybersecurity seriously. Well, my next guest is Dr. Richard Stainings, a cybersecurity strategist who's become one of the go-to experts when healthcare systems are threatened. And that includes major data breaches of medical records, hacking digital devices such as pacemakers, and even bringing down entire healthcare networks. Professor Richard Stainings, great to have some time with you, sir.
Hi there.
Now, I wonder, what sort of risks in particular do you feel the healthcare environment faces when it comes to cybersecurity? What are the key ones?
There are many risks across cybersecurity. Lack of funding results in an under-provision of cybersecurity services. Lack of prioritization results in the delay of cybersecurity policies, procedures, controls. And of course, cybersecurity is being impacted by the dramatic change of digital health, right? There is a huge transformation going on within the healthcare industry right now. The inclusion of a multitude of new IoT devices, for example. Artificial intelligence is playing a big part in healthcare moving forward. And these present an expanded risk profile for the industry.
And I'm going to go into those in a bit of detail. You have a lot of experience in this sector, and I wonder from your own perspective, what is your personal worst case scenario?
Worst case scenario is that equipment in a hospital is compromised and used to assassinate a patient, right? That's an extreme risk scenario, and I don't really want to scare anyone who's watching this to think that that might happen in the immediate future, but potentially we have to look at attack vectors within the healthcare sector to understand what perpetrators may decide to do. And it's not just the monetization of stolen intellectual property that is driving cybercriminal activity. We of course have heightened geopolitical tensions today, and who's to say what some actor may decide to do in the future.
In doing my research, I think one of the things that struck me the most and was quite terrifying was how a few years ago the FDA in the US, the Food and Drug Administration, recalled devices, pacemakers. It sounds strange to recall a pacemaker because they were vulnerable to cyber attacks. So it makes me wonder, how much of a threat is that in this day and age?
It's a very real threat. Unfortunately, most of our medical devices that are in use, whether they're embedded like a pacemaker or an infusion pump for insulin, for example, or whether they're a large-scale medical device that we use to scan a patient, an X-ray or CT or PET or ultrasound system, for example, or a patient telemetry monitoring system, right? These are all systems that were designed for medical or clinical functionality. They weren't designed with security in mind, and it's only recently, thanks to FDA regulation change last year, that we've begun to see security designed in from the outset, and also medical device manufacturers being held liable to maintain the security of those devices. By that I mean conduct vulnerability assessments, make those vulnerability disclosures available rather than hide them, which has happened in the past, and to release patches in a timely manner so that systems can be updated and upgraded. The problem is the number of legacy medical devices. There are literally millions of medical devices that will be with us for the next 20 years. And those are not subject to the FDA rules. So we have a bit of a gap, as it were, in terms of how do we go about securing those devices.
Who could have imagined in the Internet of Things, as we call it, that includes now people, people having devices in their bodies, even that could be vulnerable. And I guess as technology advances, we're going to have more and more cyber parts, if you want to put it that way, which are going to be even more vulnerable to attacks. So this is a serious concern. It's
very much a serious concern, and you've only got to look at the growth of consumer medical wearables, right? We all walk around with an Apple Watch on our hands, or a Fitbit, or some other device that is tracking our level of physical activity. It's tracking our calorific intake if we program that into, or we enter that data into the system, and that is then being communicated via an mHealth app, right, a mobile health app, to our medical record in many countries. And Australia, as an example, has opened up My Health Record, which is their national health record, to include consumer medical data, so that data that a person generates as a result of their activity is now being entered into their electronic patient record.
Now, one thing that surprised me a lot when you and I had a chat prior to this interview was when you told me that the healthcare systems that generate more data, far more data, than all other sectors combined. That just sounds staggering.
Yeah, it is. And the lakes of data should probably not be referred to as lakes anymore. They're more like oceans of data, right? Medical activity creates a massive amount of data, and of clinical treatments, of patient outcomes, all of this sort of data. And that data is extremely valuable to the medical profession in terms of being able to mine that data for AI, for example, for clinical decision support being a classic example, and various other forms of data. But there's also a huge concern with all of that data being generated. How do we go about protecting that data so that it doesn't enter, the public realm or is not stolen by criminals?
Yeah, that was interesting to me, that there have been some really high-profile healthcare breaches affecting tens of millions of people. It was really quite shocking when I did my research. And this concept of medical identity theft was something that surprised me. What is the consequence of such attacks, cyber attacks for individuals?
So we have seen the increasing level of sophistication of cyber attacks against the healthcare industry over the past decade, right? It used to be that a perpetrator would, or a group would infiltrate a hospital system, steal medical records, and then sell those medical records. We're now seeing the industrialization of that criminal activity, so that data is passed out and sold on to other groups. So, for example, personally identifiable information is sold on to identity theft rings, right? Medical data is sold to other groups that may be able to exploit that. Medical insurance data is sold to medical insurance rings, and of course intellectual property is sold to the highest bidder. Right?
Richard, I can understand people wanting credit card details and things like this for identity theft, but what would they do with the medical information? I mean, where is it valuable to the thieves?
So the first thing is that if you or I were to have our credit card stolen, right, there is a very short lifespan for the criminals to use that particular data, right? Before we recognize that there's something going on with our account, we call our bank and we cancel the card and they issue us a new one, right? And it's in the mail within a couple of days. An inconvenience to us, but the banks are insured against criminal use, and they have anti-fraud systems and can detect nefarious activity very, very quickly. Now, a medical identity has a much, much longer lifespan. So if, for example, I, as a child, had my medical record stolen, I might not realize that until much, much later on in life, right? That information might not need to be exploited straight away. So I could have I could be involved in a hospital data theft, right? Or my identity could be involved in a hospital data theft, and the perpetrators of that crime would have years to exploit it.
So I could see that the people are scared to give out the medical information or have it out there because, for example, trying to get insurance, if the insurance company knows there are certain vulnerabilities a person has, their insurance premium might go up. But in terms of the thieves, what they could do with it, what are the most nefarious kind of uses?
Well, I suppose the most obvious is ransomware, right? It's taking that information, encrypting it to make it unreadable or unavailable, right? And then ransoming that back either to the provider of the healthcare services, the hospital system, or what we're seeing now, secondary and tertiary ransom attacks against individuals, either to persuade those individuals to contact their provider to pay a ransom to the criminals, or directly to pay a ransom to the criminals themselves so that their data is not published or their data can be unencrypted and available for them to use.
What do you believe are the most valuable lessons learned from these major breaches?
I think there are a number of lessons that can be learned. Firstly, criminals are very adept at changing their attack vectors, right? They're very creative in terms of how they exploit data once they've got hold of it, and it's a continuously moving target. And I think that represents some interesting lessons for cybersecurity professionals like myself and others, obviously, about how adept we need to be in terms of our cybersecurity defensive strategies, what tools, what people, what processes we need to bring to bear, and how we really need to prioritize cybersecurity of the healthcare industry given the state of play of the criminal attackers today.
As someone who goes and advises healthcare systems about cybersecurity, how receptive have you found them to be?
I think there's a new openness. A decade ago, I would have these conversations with ministers of health or leaders of healthcare systems around the world, and there was a certain degree of it'll never happen to us. A certain thought that would be the case. I think today there's a realization, a stark realization, that an attack is not only an inevitability, but it's just a question of time. How long and how bad will that attack be? So therefore, leaders of healthcare systems are reconsidering the prioritization of cybersecurity controls in order to protect this critical national asset.
No matter how much advice you give, the weakest link is always the human. So where does the factor of advising individuals come in?
So security education, training and awareness is probably the single biggest bang for buck for any cybersecurity professional in any profession. 97% of successful cyber attacks start with a phishing attempt, right? So if we can present some level of due diligence through training in our staff, then we've, by a large shot, reduced the threat surface to the hospital because all of our staff are working in a single, unified manner to ensure patient safety.
Now, are you optimistic that the battle against cyber attacks is being won, or is there such an evolution in the nature of these cyber attacks that we will never be safe?
It's a very good question. I think that the goalposts are moving all the time, right? This is something that is not going to be easily won, a battle that's not going to be easily won. Cyber criminals are highly inventive, and they're always coming up with new attack vectors that they can infiltrate our health data and our health IT systems, for example. The big concern is that we need to mirror those changes, right, in our defense posture in order to protect hospitals, their data, their systems, and obviously patient safety from these sorts of attacks.
Such a worrying term, attack vectors. Professor Richard Steinings, thank you very much for your time. Much
Thank
appreciated.
you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Interpol is the world's largest police force. Formed in the aftermath of the First World War, it was established to combat an increasing threat from international crime. Collaboration between countries allowed crime fighting to extend beyond national boundaries. And today, the organization has almost 200 member countries. When it comes to fighting cybercrime, that original principle of collaboration is more important than ever. I met with Dr. Neal, Interpol's Director of Cybercrime, for an insight into the agency's battle against the hackers. Dr. Jetton, great to have some time with you.
Thanks for having me.
Now, there's this romantic image of what Interpol is. It's like that kind of agents in coffee shops in romantic places like Rome and Paris having secret meetings. It's like the CIA, MI6, I guess. How real is that?
It's spot on. It's exactly like that. It's not really like that. But I don't know what a lot of agencies, you have this romantic feeling for it, and then about what you think in your head, what it's going to be, and then you come in to an agency. So I've been here for 2 months, and I didn't really have too many preconceived notions because I've been a federal agent for a long time. So I've kind of been in this space. But I will say that it has been an amazing experience just for the 2 months, and I think the strength of Interpol and the strength of my team within the Cybercrime Directorate is having, there's only roughly 40 to 50 people. There are only 2 Americans. So you're looking at a wide array of cultures and people and bringing all sorts of strengths from their walks of life.
Tell me what your son said when you said you're joining Interpol.
Yeah. Well, my son was very excited. We were actually watching an action movie at that time when so I was living in DC, and he was like, oh, like that, like James Bond. And I said, no, not exactly. And I explained kind of what I was doing, and he was less than impressed with me. But he was also kind of aware of the romantic notions of, being a federal agent and how that is. And he was like, yeah, you're still just dad,
And I guess the cybercrime area on which you focus, you head, is even more that kind of ethereal area.
I mean, it's so emerging and evolving. It is very, very tough. And I don't think when you come into law enforcement, I don't think most people, maybe nowadays, but when I came in 15 years ago, it wasn't to do cyber crimes or crimes, involving computers. You wanted to knock down doors. You wanted to put people behind, bars. You wanted to really be high speed. And I think nowadays the crime, you can almost just get rid of the word cyber and just call it crime, because there's not a lot of crime that's really not connected now to a computer, to a phone, or some other network system. You really see that. So I do think that as you progress through your career, you may have come in saying, I want to combat this type of crime, but it's very clear that you're going to have some sort of cyber background to be successful.
And yet the Hollywood image is that cyber criminals have the chance to take down entire systems. Airports can be shut down, traffic lights can be changed,
right.
Like the Die Hard 4
Sure.
kind of thing. Any reality in that?
I think everything's kind of based a little bit in reality, and then movies are, amplified to, a much higher magnitude. But can bad guys target critical infrastructure and be successful? Sure. You looked at the Colonial Pipeline incident in 2021, the U.S.'s largest fuel pipeline, and what the bad guys were able to do was go through the billing system And you would think that something maybe as innocuous as that wouldn't have such detrimental effects, but it did. The Colonial Pipeline had to shut down the entire company to contain the breach. Large lines at the pump, concern about fuel availability. So it is a reality, but it's not all doom and gloom. I will say that every day we have these sort of conferences where we come together. We talk about how do we improve cybersecurity. So I think we're making great strides.
How did you react when the CrowdStrike incident happened? It was faulty software, so it wasn't really malicious, but I think it exposed a lot of vulnerabilities.
So for us, we are not in the critical infrastructure cybersecurity vulnerability business necessarily. We're in the law enforcement business. For any sort of incident, whether it's a CrowdStrike, that wasn't quite malicious, through something that is, we really are dependent on the member countries' law enforcement to reach out to us for assistance, or in some cases maybe we'll have some intelligence through some partners that we're able to push out.
The interesting thing about that incident, though, was that it opened the door for criminals to bounce in quickly.
That's right. I mean, they're always looking. And so, again, I think you have all these national security agencies working diligently trying to identify these vulnerabilities to make it much more difficult for hackers.
It does suggest, though, that the fact they can react quickly to what was not a malicious attack and get their malicious attack in, that they're quite ahead of the game.
I do think it's a little bit of a cat and mouse game. I think that the incentive for the bad guys is financial, so that when you are really focused on making a buck, this is how you earn your living. Of course, you're going to be very, very aggressive in identifying these threats. But I will say that law enforcement, Interpol, is forward-looking, looking at emerging technology, looking at the emerging threats, and trying and try to stay right with the criminals.
As director of Cybercrime at Interpol, of course, you get to see the extremes, how bad things could be.
Right.
How worried should we be as citizens?
No, I think you should be concerned. I mean, obviously with emerging technology, but AI, quantum computing, those are obviously some issues. But just as being a parent of a child who I'm finally allowing to have a smartphone for the first time as a teenager, we have had to have sit-down conversations with them about the threats. And I'm like, your dad is the director, Interpol, cybercrime director at Interpol. You cannot be doing these things. You cannot have this app. You're too young. But I'll just say that I think schools are doing a much better job of understanding the issues as well. Parents should take some responsibility, on themselves too.
For many of us, Hollywood is that lens, and cybercrime is seen as young people, sometimes in basements. They're doing things that from their homes, effectively.
Right, in their basements behind their keyboard.
Is it real?
Yeah, I'm assuming. Yeah, that is quite a bit. I mean, but also it runs the gamut. You may think like, oh, it's a 50-year-old. Grizzled, person just down in the basement. But no, as you see in some of these ransomware incidents, they're youth. They're not even of legal age, and they're causing this sort of mayhem. So yeah, it's just somebody being able to the ability to have that tech savviness and also the will to actually cause harm. We've seen criminals all ages.
Beyond these, institutions and documents that come out through the UN and so forth, in general, how well is the world keeping up with the threat of cybersecurity? I
think well. I mean, obviously, we're always going to. It's really, I think, country dependent. As Interpol, my goal is to bring up those that maybe not as cyber mature, to bring them up to a level so that they can defend themselves, defend their citizens. I do think it's improving.
And then you do need legislation, because one of the biggest frustrations in traditional crime is legal loopholes or the lack of legal infrastructure to be able to lock the bad guys away.
Yeah, so I mean, again, Interpol is not here to tell a country what to do and how to legislate itself, but we do understand that the legality, the laws have to match the emerging crimes, and in the U.S. they're having the same issue. So that's really not something that we would directly say, person to person. What I would say, though, from any perspective, what I will say, and I'm not saying that government should make it mandatory, but if you are a victim of cybercrime, whether it's anything from being a business being attacked by ransomware, or a child who's a victim of sexual exploitation, is to contact law enforcement. I know that sometimes it can be very, very difficult to make that, because you're now suffering through the worst day of your life, and now you have to go talk to law enforcement about it. But if you really want to make I think, receive some justice and then help future victims, it is to reach out to law enforcement.
Now, I know you don't tell governments how to legislate and so on, but I do wonder, how much it impedes what you can do when it actually comes to enforcing what you're doing?
So for us, our enforcement is only through our member countries' law enforcement agencies. So it's really upon them. We'll provide them as much information, as much support as we can, and then it's on their individual governments what they do with it in their legislation.
How, again, going to this idea that hackers can create widespread havoc, how much is this kind of DDoS, a term that's come into our vocabulary now, distributed denial of service, how much of a threat is that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you see, so DDoS attacks, that's the slang for it, but
DDoS,
yeah, that's okay. So obviously it is a significant avenue of attack. But we, again, if a company or if a business or an entity is suffering from a DDoS attack or any sort of cyber attack, my point of view, and I think you would talk to anybody from law enforcement, is reach out to your local law enforcement, have them, and if they need support, then come to Interpol and Cybercrime Director, and we'll do more than anything that we can, we'll do anything that we can help.
Dr. Jetton, what is the biggest challenge that you're facing right now? What eats up your time and resources?
Well, I would always say that funding and finding personnel. Interpol, we bring in seconded officers. So basically, like myself, I come from the U.S. My home agency pays for me. I am on loan to Interpol for a few years. So it's getting those agencies from all different countries. And we want a wide spectrum. I would have like somebody from every region to come in and be a part of our team. So it's finding, the personnel, it's finding the funding for the different projects that we have. Those are the things that really take a lot of my time.
I guess the great thing about being such a diverse group of people at Interpol is that you do take back these skill sets with you and share them.
Yeah, that's the selling point. Like, we want your best and your brightest. You come to us because I know it's also a sort of a catch-22 when you send somebody who's so good, now they're not with you anymore in your home agency. So I understand that, but my hope is that when you come to us, when you leave in the 3 years, whether sometimes they're short-term secondments for a year, sometimes they're 3 years or extended, my hope is that when you go back, you use the skills that you develop, especially like the diplomacy skills, the ability to mediate, those sort of skills that you may not get as a police officer, as an agent, you take those skills back and enhance your agency.
You explained how this isn't really what you got into. You weren't really going into cybercrime,
right.
But of course everything's evolved and it's continually evolving. So is AI, artificial intelligence, your friend or enemy, for example?
No, I think any emerging technology, I'll just say, in my opinion, it's neutral. So it's whoever it's in the hands of, whatever the intent is, that's really whether it's good or bad. And so we understand the criminality, the uses of it, and criminals are always going to take advantage, whether it's AI, quantum computing. I mean, it was computers, 20 years ago, and smartphones and apps and all that. Whatever emerging crime, there's going to be some ingenious criminal who's going to try to find it and exploit it. So again, it's on us as law enforcement to be forward-looking, to say, hey, these are the emerging threats, and how can we combat that? And so within Interpol, we do have an innovation center that's also housed with Singapore that's looking at those very concerns.
This sounds like an echo of guns don't kill people, people kill
it's
people.
the same. Yeah, I don't want to compare
of course,
one to the other, but again, it really is how you use it, because I think there's going to be some great uses with AI, obviously, and then obviously it's going to be some negatives.
I think the way I've heard you put it is that basically technology is agnostic.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's how I feel.
In terms of keeping up with everything, do you have the resources to be able to keep up?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, could we always use more funding? Could we always use more personnel? Of course. I mean, any agency could. But what we should do, and I think in Cybercrime Director, is we should be more forward leaning and continued sustained communications with our 196 member countries to actually ask them, what do you need? Because we may think from Singapore, these are the cyber concerns that we think you should be concerned about, and yet it may not be. So that's part of my strategy, is to conduct outreach with those members to say, what exactly do you need from Interpol?
How do you regard the term cyber psychology, and how does that fit in with what you do?
For me, from a law enforcement perspective, what I want to always look at is when we go and interview a victim, whether the victim is a business, a hospital, and have to talk to the CISO who's now suffering through stress, and I'm not comparing them, or to talk to somebody who's been a victim of some sort of sexual exploitation, especially with children, is to understand that is their worst day. And so for law enforcement, I think our goal is always to get the evidence, to get the interview, and then go on and catch the bad guy and stop the next thing from happening. But I think from law enforcement, we have to take a step back and realize that these are some bad days, the worst days that these people are suffering through, to show them some grace, show them some kindness at the same time.
Technology is moving fast, but let me wrap up by asking you if you could paint me a picture of what the cybercrime scene might look like maybe a decade from now.
So, I wish I had a magic ball and I knew who to invest in, which companies were going to be a part. But obviously AI, that's the buzzword, AI. I think quantum, computing and the encryption that's going to, become problematic in the future. I think those are things that I'm sure criminals are already salivating at the thought of. I think that there are the law enforcement and other government agencies that are also looking at that and saying, no, we're going to be ready for this. We're going to, maybe not everything, but the focus isn't just going to be on for the criminals. We're actually going to concentrate on these things too. So I will just say though that Interpol has been in existence. We just celebrated our 100th anniversary last year. So 1923 to 2023. And so in 10 years, I think the Interpol and Interpol's cybercrime directorate will still be combating, transnational cybercrime and still being a good partner to 196 member countries.
Dr. Neal Jetton, thank you very much. Good luck with your work.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Let's continue that theme of cyber psychology with a woman whose work in the field inspired the hit TV crime drama CSI Cyber. In fact, her character is played by an Oscar-winning Hollywood actress. As many experts will tell you, humans are often regarded as the weakest link when it comes to cybersecurity. Dr. Mary Aiken's work includes profiling hackers and identifying their vulnerabilities. But she's ready to back her own brain against AI any day. Dr. Mary Aiken, great to have a chance to chat with you because it's been fascinating to find out the kind of areas you cover. Now, I do want to start though with your role on CSI Cyber, how you've been portrayed there. Tell me about that.
Yes, actually, I was doing some work for the White House on tech solutions to human trafficking, and there was some publicity around it, and afterwards I got a call from William Morris, and I thought it was Philip Morris, the cigarette company, okay. So I said, I don't do endorsements. Anyway, turned out to be an agency. They brought me to Hollywood. I met some people, and the next thing, they created a division of the show, CSI New York, CSI Miami, CSI Cyber, based on my work, and Patricia Arquette played me in the show.
That's pretty good. I was like, your work's at least getting some visibility there as well. And I want to ask you, how much does a TV series like that actually portray the reality?
I think that, they're metaphors. So when we're talking about something in a television show, what we're trying to do is sort of provide explanatory value. We're trying to educate general population. So there's a famous scene that we did had this operator looking at code on the screen, and it was all green, and all of a sudden the malware showed up as red, and the operator said, oh, we've got malware. And of course the InfoSec community went crazy because they said, that's not how it works. Malware doesn't jump out as red code. But it was a metaphor that an experienced operator would see it as red code. Of course, there was all this trouble online about it and how we were dumbing down, computer science and InfoSec. And then the US Army cavalry came to my rescue in the form of West Point. And they wrote an article in defense of CSI Cyber saying how important it was. The series aired in 170 countries worldwide.
One thing is new to a lot of people is this term cyber psychology. Explain that in a simple way.
Cyber psychology is the study of the impact of technology on human behavior. It's about 20 years old as a discipline, which is really young. And I'm one of the pioneers in the field. I'm a professor of cyber psychology in London, and I'm a professor of forensic cyber psychology in the US. Forensic cyber psychology is the study of criminal, deviant, and abnormal behavior, and I'm kept pretty busy.
I'm sure. And I love the fact you're not scared to speak your mind, because I know you don't really like the term cyber resilience. Explain why.
Yes, so we're here at GCF, and we had a panel earlier today talking about cyber resilience, well, cognitive resilience particularly. And I suppose, as a cyber behavioral scientist, you often come across these terms, and my guess is, and yeah, I'm probably right, I'm sure it was a term invented by a computer scientist who said, Well, we've got resilience in systems, and they can, be resilient during an attack, and then they can bounce back quickly afterwards. So let's retranspose that construct to humans and then develop resilience in humans. My point is that, okay, if we're going to talk about resilience, let's talk about the psychology of resilience. So across the general population, if you had, say, 4 people in a family, there's a strong genetic component. One person will have no resilience, 2 of them will be 50-50 on resilience, and 1 will be extremely resilient. So I object to the term because where are we going with collective cybersecurity? Is it a Darwinian push towards survival of the tech fittest? That's not fair.
So really, that is an interesting thought. Tech fittest or cyber fittest, in effect. Someone who can handle that. Basically, that suggests it's not just a simple vertical silo. It's not something that can be handled in a simple way. It has to be a much broader understanding.
I think you've got to factor the human into the equation, and not in a sort of, scientific or computer science or infosec science way of sort of an approximation of what it is to be human. When we talk about protecting critical infrastructure, what is the most critical infrastructure that we're trying to protect? It's humans, it's us, our families, our communities, our cities, our nations. That's what we're trying to protect, is the humans.
From your research and all that you've seen in your studies, how much more vulnerable are we now? The fact we all have devices, young people have access to almost everything. You say cyber psychology, the impact of this technology on our minds, it must be pretty intense.
Well, when things go wrong, look, there are a lot of things that are great about tech. I was just asked earlier about internet addiction and how do I control my technology use. I'm probably the worst person. I'm a cyber psychologist. I spend a disproportionate amount of my time online. But the point is, in terms of you and I, we're sort of done, we're cooked. Like, not a lot is going to go wrong in terms of our neural activity and our use of technology. But the developing child, when I see 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds with mobile phone devices, when, millions of neurons are making connections, we have to think about that. There's a great paper by the American Academy of Pediatrics, and it's called The Good, the Bad, and the Unknown. I worry about the unknown in terms of the impact of technology on the developing child.
How much real thought is being given to this right now? Because everyone seems to run at such a fast pace. Do people pay enough attention to this potential unknown?
I think that to a certain extent, parents have sort of given up. It's too much. They're trying to manage and juggle their busy lives. The kids seem happy on their devices. And there's not enough education and awareness raising about the impact of that technology in a good way, in terms of like enhancing fine motor skills and, the deficits associated with that and the problems associated with age-inappropriate use of technology. So I think we just have to be, we need, in the real world, we have ages of development. If you have children, you knew what age they should sit up and say their first words and take their first step. What's the equivalent in a cyber context in terms of ages of cyber development? And how do we inform parents about that?
Now, when people talk about cyber threats, cyber attacks and so on, I know you also have a very clear perspective on this because they do vary.
Yes, again, we were discussing earlier and somebody was saying, a cyber attack is a major event and then everything else should be considered a cyber incident. I don't agree with that. If somebody broke into your home and hit you over the head and went upstairs and pulled up your mattress and took, your savings, $10,000 from under your bed, that's an attack. When somebody is targeted online in terms of cyber fraud or extortion in terms of an investment that goes wrong, which is, cyber fraudulent investment, and somebody loses their life's savings and they're humiliated and incredibly depressed as a result, that's an attack. If a young boy is coerced into a relationship online and then sextorted as a result, that's an attack. If a small business is held to ransom and people lose their livelihood in terms of a ransomware attack, that's not an incident. That is an attack.
How do you regard disinformation and deep fakes and fake news? What sort of attack do they present then?
I think disinformation, and we've seen in the UK recently, how disinformation online can lead to public disorder. And, you know, there's a symbiotic relationship between cyberspace and the real world. What happens in cyberspace impacts the real world. What happens in the real world impacts cyberspace. So when you get this massive amounts of mis and disinformation online, it can lead to public order incidents. I mean, we saw that with the March on Capitol Hill in the US. And mis and disinformation, the potential impact in terms of elections. Mis and disinformation for young people. There was a recent piece of research, and something like 60% of young people thought that mainstream media was disinformation, fake news. So how are we going to maintain social order in civil society when people can no longer trust sources?
You're a pioneer in cyber psychology, and AI has come in now. Everything's moving so fast. How hard is it for you to keep up, and what impact is AI going to have?
Oh, I can beat AI any day, hands down. I mean, I've got a million-year-old piece of technology that's been in development for 1 million years, the human brain. On any given day, that is going to beat AI. AI, we mistake it as human intelligence because it can do some things incredibly quickly. That's not intelligence. That's just a task. That's like sweeping versus using a hoover. You know, it's not intelligence. As a behavioral scientist, I can categorically say that we barely understand how the human brain works. To create something that replicates something we don't understand, it's a false premise. So I think what we have to do is look at not AI replacing humans, but IA, intelligence augmentation, the work of Licklider, who wrote in 1950 about man-computer symbiosis, that symbiotic relationship between man and machine, placing the human at the center of the decision-making process.
Let's end with perhaps 3 bullet point pieces of advice to people on how they can build their sense of strength against this, how they can, if you like, manage their cyber psychology.
I think the first thing that people need to do is understand the potential impact of technology on their lives. The second thing they've got to do is educate themselves about what the possibilities are and what strategies they could deploy. And then the third strategy is actually deploy. Do it. Just do it.
Dr. Mary Aiken, what a pleasure. Thank you so much. I look forward to speaking with you again.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Sound advice from cyber psychologist Dr. Mary Aiken. I leave you with one final thought. If you're hearing about cybersecurity for the first time, you might not know that the US has declared October to be Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Even more surprising is the fact that it first did so 20 years ago. The battle continues. And that's all for this edition of the show. I'm Riz Khan. From me and the team, thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.